you're on mission in community, you're looking outward, you're inviting people in, and you're really trying to replicate the words of Jesus, the ways of Jesus, and to know him and to share him in a way that it's like a lifestyle, not just this add-on.
Hey there, you're listening to the Girls Talking Life podcast, and I'm your host, Johanna. If you're like me, you love time with friends. I always leave feeling encouraged, inspired to try something different, or I've learned something new. So why not continue to grow even when we can't be with our girlfriends? We're not made to do life on our own. So in each episode of this show, I'll bring you a girl and her story to give you refreshing ideas to stir your soul. Let's walk this road together. Are you ready to talk life? Hey friend, you are listening to episode number 133. I just learned that Girls Talking Life was ranked in the top 50 Christian podcasts in India. If you are listening from India, thank you. I am honored and excited, and I'm so glad you're here. In the last episode, I mentioned that the GTL newsletter, my email to you, is now going to come out on Thursdays of the week a new episode is released. And the newsletter is where you'll find all the details about the show, free goodies, friendship tips, and it is the only place that you're going to see the favorite 5 of all my guests, including links to all the things they love. And this week, my guest is giving away a copy of her book to one lucky subscriber. So if you don't get the GTL newsletter yet, now is the time to get signed up. Find the link in the show notes. How well do you know the people in close proximity to you? How well do you love them? Jesus tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves, but how do we actually do that? Missional neighboring advocate Twyla Franz is on the show today helping us get close to Jesus and grow deep missional friendships with our neighbors. You'll hear us talk about what missional living is, what it means to be visible and interruptible, how humility and curiosity can deepen our friendships, and you'll hear us talk about overcoming the obstacles to missional neighboring. Twyla Franz is a big believer in baby steps and ripple effect living. An Enneagram 9 learning to live open-handed, she loves front yard conversations with neighbors, chalk-painted furniture, and Yogi's blueberry tea. All right, here is my conversation with Twyla. Hey, Twyla, thank you for coming on Girls Talking Life. I am so excited to talk with you today.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
You are a fellow Enneagram 9.
Mm-hmm.
And you call yourself a missional neighboring advocate. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself beyond that and then unpack what that means? Missional neighboring.
Sure. Missional neighboring is just a very simple way to say that we have a ripple effect in the way that we live our lives. And I'll start first with how I define missional neighboring, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about me. So missional neighboring, I just really like to boil it down, say it's not as complicated. Discipleship is not as complicated as we often make it out to be. It's really about 2 things. And one is getting really close to Jesus, because whatever's inside of us is going to show on the outside. And then the other part is that we are letting the people, especially the people that are close to us, near us, proximity wise, truly get to know us. So it's getting close to Jesus and it's letting people get close to us. So that makes opportunity for those things that God is working out inside of us to ripple out beyond us. This is something that I have started learning and living just in the last few years. It's not a concept that I was familiar with prior to that, but there was a church that we were going to, and this is several years back, and that's where we learned this concept of missional living and what they called missional communities, which are kind of like a small group or a Bible study, but it's much more focused on, this is not something that you're just attending one day of the week, but it's kind of this integrated lifestyle where you're bumping into each other throughout the week. You're on mission in community. You're looking outward. You're inviting people in, and you're really trying to replicate the words of Jesus, the ways of Jesus, and to know him and to share him in a way that it's like a lifestyle, not just this add-on. So that's kind of where we started, was some weekend intensives is what they were called. They were everyday mission training, I believe is what the name was. And we read Mike Breen, Caesar Kalinowski, and We were in a missional community. We were being mentored by people in the church. And then at one point we were in what was called a huddle, which is just kind of a more intense missional community with a goal to raise you up as a leader. So we launched out of that and started leading our own group, co-leading with some friends of ours.
That sounds so great. Like the whole missional living and bumping into each other on a regular basis. But that isn't reality for most of us. Talk to me a little bit more about what that looks for you right now in your real life, actually doing it.
Mm-hmm. And that is so true. It is not a way of living that feels automatic or natural, even though so many of us live in suburbia America. We live in these neighborhoods. We're surrounded by people all the time. But if you look at the stats of how lonely we are, it's staggering. Really, really, truly, how many of us don't feel seen by the people who are right in front of us. We don't know very many people. I think it's really common that we spend a lot of time inside our houses, in our backyards. Maybe we have the high security fences. Like, we really don't see neighbors' faces as often as you would think, just because we're close proximity wise. And so it takes an intentional shift to say, I'm going to go a different direction and I'm going to be more visible. I think that's kind of a lot of where we started, is just saying, I can't get to know my neighbors if they never see me, if they don't, if they never see me outside. I'm not going to learn their names. I'm not going to learn their stories. So we just started moving into, let's spend more time in our front yard. Let's spend more time walking the neighborhood. And that begins to shift, where instead of grabbing your mail and, kind of looking down and just grabbing it, hurrying back into the house real quick, or pulling into your garage and getting out, closing the garage door and then getting out and really trying to avoid contact because you're busy and you're just, consumed with what you're doing. It's raising your eyes and looking outward and saying, well, there's people out here that I really want to connect with. So I'm going to intentionally move toward them.
I'm thinking about my life, and I have deep friendships with different women, all across my city. But in my actual neighborhood, I know my neighbors. We say hello. We might stop and chat, but those aren't deep friendships. So I hear you saying, spend more time outside. But once we're actually talking with them, what do we do? What do we do to deepen that and create that really special bond?
Yes. And I relate to a whole lot of your story, because that was me too for a long time. And even when we were attending a missional community, at that point, it was hosted at different houses, and some of them were 20 minutes away. So we saw them once a week, but it was kind of hard to break into this. I really am doing life with you outside of the group, because we weren't super, super close. I mean, the same area of town, but not the same way as it is if it's actually in your neighborhood. And so we had that desire to actually take what we were doing and put it right within walking distance of the majority of the people who had come. And I think that really started to shift, where we said, okay, I'm not just going to only drive across town or meet friends outside, but I really want to start cultivating those deeper friendships here. And so it was not something that happened super fast. It's kind of this slow, gradual thing where you're spending more time outside, you start noticing people, you start asking questions about the flowers that they're working on or the projects that they're doing. You start asking for help in like little ways, like, hey, can we borrow a ladder? Or, hey, I ran out of vanilla or an egg. Like, just these little everyday things that take a lot of humility sometimes to say, you know what? I kind of forgot about something and I'm in the middle of cooking dinner. Like, is it okay if I use this or borrow this? So it's just these little tiny ways that we started shifting. What is it that makes the friendships that are not right here next to me really deep and meaningful, and saying, well, let's start to be intentional with that kind of mentality right where we are. And so I found that visibility is not, it doesn't automatically guarantee that you're going to go deep with people, but it is kind of the tip of the iceberg because it creates opportunity that you can start to lean into these deeper conversations. And another concept is to be interruptible, which is really, really challenging sometimes, especially when we have these busy lives. But to say, well, maybe I don't have an hour to spend out here, but I have 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and I can find something to just to linger in my front yard because I am more visible. And if those opportunities come up, somebody's walking by, to say, well, I want to be interruptible. Like, that's my goal right now. So I'm going to lean into that conversation, maybe ask some more questions.
You talked about getting close to Jesus as being kind of step one, because then that overflows in your everyday life and the people that you're talking to outside your house. What are some things that you have done to deepen that relationship with him?
Sure. I really, really like worship songs, especially the kind that are deep and raw. And you actually recommended one that I ended up playing on repeat probably for months.
It was a good one.
Yes, it was so good. It was worthy of it all, right? I think it was you that recommended it. So that I have found is really, really, really helpful, just to change the words that are in my head, kind of reframe maybe the names that I call myself or the things that I believe are true of God, when it's kind of these truths are on repetition. It rewrites your brain in a really, really fascinating way because you keep hearing it over and over and over. So that's worship songs is one really, really big thing for me. Journaling and just getting really honest with God is another one. I have found too, in the last 6 months or so, there have been a couple things that just felt really, really, really heavy. One was with my family, and one was totally not related, but both of them had this way of, one, making me want to turn on those worship songs because I needed it in a really real way. But I spend a lot more time on my knees, and I found that really changed the way that I talk to God. And sometimes it's crying out to him. Sometimes it's just being quiet and listening. Sometimes it's short. Sometimes I have more time, and I can just kind of stay there and linger and ask God, what are you saying to me? What do I need to hear right now? So I have put that practice into my morning routine, whether I feel like I need it or not. That's just going to be something like I'm going to spend at least a few minutes just on my knees, face down, just listening, spending time reading the Bible. And I found that I really, really enjoy reading slow, which is, kind of different. At one point, I read through the entire Bible in a year, but I find that when I linger and I slow down, and sometimes I'm just reading maybe a few verses and I reread. I like repetition, if you can't tell. So I might reread those same verses for several days, and they're half memorized by the end. But I find that I just pay more attention to the words, like, what is God saying through this, when I don't rush through it.
I know for me that as I've grown in my faith and my relationship with Jesus, that, like you were saying, you're reminded of your identity. And that helps me step out then in confidence with my neighbors or with whatever friends, I'm spending time with, and allows me to be more authentically myself.
Definitely. And I think that ties in really, really well, because when we are listening, when we're letting God really do deep work inside of us, we're coming to him with our honest questions. Maybe we're talking out loud, or we're journaling, or whatever that looks like. Maybe your verbal processor, so you're talking with people. But regardless of how those conversations begin, I think that we begin to bridge into that other piece where we're letting people get really close to us. When we have all this stuff that God is doing inside of us, we have, if we're not in conversation with God, we can't share the conversations that we're having with him with other people. So, we got to start with, we are regularly spending time with God. Otherwise, we're just kind of empty. But I love the verses, and there's so many of them that talk about what God gives us really is not meant just for us. Like, he gives us more than we need because he wants it to overflow beyond us. So when I take, okay, these are my conversations with God, but I don't just keep super quiet about it. I start to let people into, this is the way that I'm really struggling to believe that God is good right now. Like I know in my head that he is, but it's really hard to see it right now. And when you begin to open up about those things that feel a little messier, they're not finished yet. They don't necessarily feel safe. They might be the real questions that you're asking God, or the things that you're actually praying about that, you might not want to share with everybody. But when you start to let some people into those conversations, especially when it's your neighbors, then that changes the relationship. It begins to go a whole lot deeper.
Absolutely. And if you're not ready to go there yet, I was hearing a conversation recently where the person was saying, just share, might have been my pastor, just share your life as you normally would. Like say, I can't meet you on Sunday morning because I go to church. Or, we take the kids to their small group on Wednesday nights. Just be open and vocal about the things that you're doing. Or first thing in the morning, I read my Bible. Little things like that might lead into those deeper conversations that you were just talking about later on.
So true. So true. And when you start with those things that just feel really natural, like this is just part of my day, then it doesn't feel weird or preachy when you start talking about, well, this is what God is showing me, and you're also coming at it from, this is just a piece of my life. This is my story, and it intersects with God's story. So it's just, natural to bring it up. It really does help us come from a place more of, I'm just relatable. It's more humble to say, well, this is a part of my day, and this is how I'm learning and growing in the midst of it. So it doesn't have to be like, I have this all figured out. I'm on top of my schedule. I'm on top of all of these things, or I can rattle off the reference to every Bible verse. It just breaks down all of those things these expectations that we put on ourselves. Like we have to know everything. We have to be a perfect Christian. We have to have our lives all cleaned up before we can start to let people in. And it really doesn't have to be that way, because, the real life stuff that we're working out and learning and growing, that can be the best kind of conversations. But you're so right that starting with these are just, little tiny pieces that you can weave in as you're having a normal conversation, because it's just a part of your life.
And either one of those, the lighter notes or the deeper conversations, they don't feel like you're preaching or giving information that person doesn't want. Do you know what I mean? What we think of maybe as evangelism. You're not knocking on the door and telling them that they need to read their Bible or go to church. You're just simply saying, this is what I do, or this is what God is telling me right now.
Yes. And it's such a difference, and it's refreshing, because I think that so many Christians give God a bad rap, and it's because we're really not reflecting his heart in the way that is accurate. And it changes the dynamics a lot when you just say, hey, I'm not perfect either. God's still at work in me. I'm going to start to let you see a little bit of that. And something else that I was wrestling through a while back, and I think it kind of ties into this conversation, is we sometimes try to keep people accountable at a distance. And I think in the context of neighbors and this call that you feel to share Christ, it can be really easy to start to make people feel judged because of the way or the tone. And they know that you're a Christian. And so, they assume that you're going to have ideas, comparisons about them. So getting to know the actual people completely changes it, because nobody wants an accountability partner that you haven't actually given access to your life. And it can feel like that when we push those words or our opinions or ideas that really can feel divisive ahead of actually knowing real people and knowing their story. And so if we lean into the humility that we were talking about, but also curiosity, and ask questions, get to know their story. Like, don't just, step in with, this is what I do, but to get really, really interested in, what is their life like? What are they struggling with? What are they hoping for? What are they praying for? Because probably a lot of us are praying for something, even if they wouldn't call themselves a Christian. Like, there's still things that they're kind of wanting God to do or to come through for them. And so if you can start to open up into those more vulnerable conversations, I think it changes the way that someone will view you when you start sharing about your faith and who God means to you.
So good, Twyla. Jesus was relational, and we should be too. Hey there, I am interrupting our conversation for a quick minute to let you know about today's sponsor. Do you have a special occasion or a special person that you want to commemorate? Are you looking for a personalized gift for someone celebrating something or even grieving? Connie Lawson has a passion for creating precious keepsakes. The loss of her firstborn son ignited this passion. It served as a way to keep him close, grieve, and remember the preciousness of his short but meaningful life. Connie now creates custom pieces to help you remember your special and precious ones. From new babies to wedding announcements and everything in between, she is here to create an original piece just for you. Visit her website, weedsseedsbeautifulthings.com, to choose a print from the pieces she's already created, or to begin the conversation with Connie about the design of your custom piece. Custom art by Connie Lawson connects your needs and your heart with her paintbrush to bring to life a moment, a memory, a season of grief, or one of joy. Once again, that is weedsseedsbeautifulthings.com. Now back to our conversation. So there are plenty of obstacles when it comes to deepening friendships, getting to know our neighbors. What are you hearing from people? What do they struggle with when taking on this task of missional neighboring?
Yes. And there are a lot of roadblocks, I think, that come to mind. This was a while back. I put together a series called Obstacles to Neighborhood Missional Living. And I did some polls and, asked questions on Instagram and just tried to get a feel for what are people most struggling with. And then I wrote a blog post and had an audio recording of it as well. So I put together this series, and as I look through how many people go to each one of those posts or episodes, the top one is, I'm introverted. And I think a lot of us, I know
me.
Yes. And it resonates with me because I am too. If you look back, or if you knew me as a kid, I was the super shy kid who had a hard time making eye contact, and it was super awkward all the time, and you could hardly get me to talk. So that to now I'm talking about getting to know your neighbors, and you might think it comes super easily, but it honestly doesn't always. And I have found that as an Enneagram 9, the very first hello or the very first contact can sometimes feel like, I don't know if I'm ready for this. So it takes this mind over matter to say, well, I'm usually fine as soon as we start talking. But that hurdle in my head is, well, this is going to feel really awkward, or they're really not very interested, or I'm going to have nothing to say, or I can't think of anything, to contribute to this conversation fast enough. So there are so many ways that introverts have these beautiful strengths that they can bring to this, and they're very deep people. And there are ways that they relate and connect and can be a friend in a way that an extrovert doesn't grasp, because they're just not wired in the same way. And so I think that part of it is just understanding that we are unique and we have these strengths that are different from each other, but that's a really beautiful thing. And just because we might need more time alone to recoup or to re-energize doesn't mean that we can't lean into these deeper conversations. And it also takes some of the pressure off to realize that it's not going to look the same for everybody. For one person, it might be hosting a big missional community, and you might have a whole lot of people and kids and chaos in your house. But it might be inviting one person over to join your family for dinner, or it might be coffee, or it might be somebody knocks on your door and it's a little messy inside, and you let them in regardless and let them see your lived in space and just connect with them on here's a human level. So I think a lot of ways we just make it feel far more intimidating because we have this whole big grand picture of what it has to look like. And if we break it down to smaller steps and say, well, what can I do right now? What can I do today? Who's right in front of me that I can pay a little more attention to? And then it takes the pressure off.
I love that.
Yeah. So the introverts was one of the very, very biggest ones. A lot of us are busy. And that is also another one that the people will come back to is we just run our lives at this breakneck pace. Our kids are in every sport, every activity. We're always running. And it feels really countercultural sometimes to say, no, I'm going to actually schedule some white space into our weekly calendar, because if we don't, we might not have any time to actually connect with our neighbors. And so sometimes it does come down to some hard choices and saying, what are our values? What are our priorities? And if really putting deep roots where you live is super important, there might come a time that you have to say, well, we're going to limit what we're doing on a weekend, or we're going to cut back just a little bit. And that doesn't mean necessarily changing your entire schedule, because again, we can jump to these massive conclusions like, well, if I need more space, I need a ton more space and I have to change But if we start to think small, what is one little thing that we could do to create a little bit more margin? So that way we're just a little more available to connect. House being too small is another one. So not everybody lives in a big giant house where you just have this massive table and all this space to invite people. And that was us for quite a few years when we started learning about the concept of missional community. So when I think back to what would I tell myself then, because we didn't have an extra chair around our table, and it really felt like we couldn't start this until we moved and had more space. But I realized after we moved, it's a bigger house, but it's a project house. And the time that we spent in this little rental house really prepared our hearts to say, well, it doesn't have to be perfect. And just because we have more space doesn't mean we have more table space right away. It doesn't mean that we have every room is furnished. There's all these things that are always in process when you're renovating or, even just updating a house. And so it really taught us humility to say, well, this is what our house actually looks like. And it's okay for you to come in with our kitchen that's still straight up 90s and, all these things. Like it really, really doesn't matter that we have the perfect space. So again, we can break it down and start saying, well, is my space big enough to invite one person over? Maybe you don't have space to invite a massive family or several families at the same time, but could you bring some lawn chairs and your fire pit out to the front yard? Or can you just spend a little bit more time walking your neighborhood or lingering in your front yard and connecting with people? It doesn't even have to be inside of your house. It could be in your garage. It could be out in your front yard. So I think all these obstacles I feel really, really big. We can just dial it down and say, what's right in front of me? What are some small steps that I can take to start shifting my mindset and moving in a different direction?
What if we have a neighbor who is not responsive to our greetings, our conversation? Just, you can tell that they don't want to start this relationship with you. What do you do then?
I think we just keep loving people, but don't overwhelm them, because we don't have to force a timeline. We cannot control the outcome. All we can do is to be obedient to the things that God is saying to us to do. And it might not look the same for everybody. It might not look the same for every season. So it may be a neighbor that, it just kind of feels abrasive, that's not very interested. Well, maybe sometime God just nudges your heart to do something that's super kind, that would be really unexpected. And you never know what kind of seeds that's going to plant. So I think it's really, for those situations, it's just coming back to that time that you're spending with God, because it's not for our brains to figure out. God's going to nudge us to each one of those little steps, and we don't have to know what's going to happen next. But that's all I would say, is to keep listening, keep asking God what's next, especially for this neighbor, like, God, how do I love them well? And just to be obedient in those little steps.
So very good. Twyla, I am going to move into the next segment of the interview where I ask for your favorite 5 things.
Okay.
I just like to get to know you a little bit outside of your mission, just personally. And I want to know what you're loving. What are 5 things that you're watching or wearing or drinking right now that are your favorite things?
Sure. This is super fun. My first one is a song. So talking about songs that we play on repeat, the Worthy of It All song that you had mentioned, there is a version that Zariah Zachary sings. And so I've been following her because her voice somehow just fills the room and it's incredible. So I pay attention whenever she releases something new, and she doesn't have a lot that's solely her, like she'll sing with her church worship team or she'll sing with somebody else. But I found this song, it released recently. It's called Enough, and it's so good. It is by Bristol House, which is her church's worship team, and she sings lead in the song. And I have been playing it on repeat for several weeks now. It's just amazing. And so
I need to check that out.
Yes, I'll send it to you. It is so good. The second one that comes to mind is a journal. So talking about this honest journaling, it can feel sometimes like you don't know where to start or what to say if it's just a blank journal. And the one that I've been loving is Stuff I'd Only Tell God by Jennifer Dukesley. And you're probably familiar with it. I love, love, love this journal because it will take you to so many conversations with God that you would never think to go. And one, it's really healing to talk to him about those things. But 2, it also gives you ideas, conversation starters, and maybe just a little bit more bravery to start tapping into some of those deeper conversations and bring that, into your conversations with your neighbors. So it can help you as you're opening up to God say, well, now I can maybe share a little piece of something that he's working on in me. So that journal I found is super, super helpful.
That's such a great one because I know for me, that journal page, the blank one, it's really intimidating.
Yes, it certainly can be. I have 2 journals, the Stuff I'd Only Tell God, and then I also write daily in, it is a blank one, but it's kind of my everything journal. So I write down scripture verse that stood out to me from what I've read. It's my ongoing gratitude list. It's notes and random thoughts, so everything is chronological, but it's a really big mess. So because I know exactly what I'm writing, like I'm just, here's another number, here's my gratitude list, or here's a Bible verse. And sometimes I'll just write out a prayer that's, just between me and God. So that helps, I think, with a blank journal, but I really, really love all the prompts in Stuff I'd Only Tell God. Number 3 is another book, but it's the Passion Translation version of the one that I have is the New Testament, Psalms, Proverbs. Maybe that's it. So they don't have the whole Bible translated. They have a few other books that are kind of packaged separately. And I recently read Isaiah, which is also really, really good. But I love reading in a translation that is different from anything that I had memorized as a kid because the language is fresh in it and just helps me pay attention differently. The words will hit me differently because my mind doesn't just fill in the blanks. And so whether it's a Passion Translation or something else, I highly recommend spending some time in a translation that's just very different from what you normally read. So I love, love, love that. Another one is Tuscany's Farmhouse Collection candles. They have soy candles in their mason jars. And the one that is my favorite is called Fireside, and it smells kind of like Cracker Barrel and like smoky fireplace. Yes, I love it.
That sounds so nice.
And then something that I drink every single day. I love tea, and Yogi has a blueberry tea that is amazing. So that is my every single morning.
Very nice. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. Mm-hmm. Twyla, what would you say is your final encouragement or even a practical action step that we could take this week as we just want to move toward our neighbors?
Great question. And I'll share this. It's just a short line that has kind of become a mantra for me. And we've touched on it in our conversation when we're talking about taking what feels really big and overwhelming and making it small. So it's right in front of us. But the way that I say it, and it's a reminder to me every single day, because I come back to it often, is that the direction is more important than the pace. And so if we're thinking about where we want to be relationally with God and with our neighbors, if we think of it as this is a trajectory or an arrow, this is where I want to move toward, but it can be these really little baby steps, and all those are going to matter in the end because it's all moving us in a direction, but it takes the pressure and the overwhelm off where we don't have to get there overnight. And so it gives us purpose in those little everyday moments when you're like, oh, just my 5 minutes here, or, this quick hello or a smile at a neighbor. Does it really matter? We come back to, well, where are we heading? And if this is helping us head that direction, then yes, it matters.
That's really good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You are the sweetest, and your neighbors are lucky to have you. We are lucky to have you here with us today. And I think you're just doing really good work, one small baby step at a time. And I thank you so much for coming on and encouraging us to do the same thing, because it's what we're called to do. And it can be intimidating and it can be hard, but I don't think it has to be. And based on all the things that you just shared, it doesn't. So thank you, Twyla. I am so glad that I got to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you. And you're so right. It can feel so intimidating, but I just wanted to say one last thing is that it brings so much joy to have these deeper relationships. Or when you look through your neighborhood and you're like, I've been in quite a few of my neighbors' houses. I've held their kid while they're cooking dinner, or they've let me cry ugly tears here, listen to what's actually going on. It really does make for a much, much richer community when the people that you see pretty often actually know you.
Thanks for listening. One of my very favorite things that Twyla said was that we don't have to know what's going to happen next. That is not for our brains to figure out. I love it in the context of missional neighboring, but oh my goodness, it applies to every area of our lives. We don't have to know what's going to happen next. I don't know about you, but that allows me to feel so much freedom. Twyla talked about being vulnerable, and she gave us a couple examples of asking neighbors for help. And I didn't share this in our conversation, but I call on my neighbors for so many things. I have used my neighbor's oven when mine was broken. I have used my neighbor's dryer when mine was broken. Different neighbors. And we ask a third set of sweet neighbors to take care of our dog when we go out of town on trips where we can't take him with us. And while I was editing this episode, I felt compelled to stop and text my neighbor that I haven't seen in a while. It's winter. It's been cold. I have not been visible, but I stopped and I texted her and invited her to coffee. Check out Twyla's book, Cultivating a Missional Life, a 30-day devotional to gently help you open your heart, home, and life to your neighbors, and her podcast, The Uncommon Normal. If you're not already, become a GTL newsletter subscriber for a chance to win her book. And let's overcome the obstacles and live on mission in our neighborhoods. Friend, don't let the conversation stop when the show is over. Share your story and start your own conversations with the girls in your life, with your neighbors. I will see you back here in March. Thanks for tuning in.